We'll return to that, but let's move to a story I've mentioned on a couple of times, which is that freedom of speech is to be enshrined in a new British Bill of Rights to protect against political correctness and the advance of wokery, as it's called. Here to explain is Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary Dominic Raab. Good to have you on. Can you define wokery? Mr. Raab, good morning.
I'm not sure that by the way, good morning, Nick. We are looking forward to putting forward our proposals for human rights reform and a Bill of Rights. I'm not sure the characterisation around wokery is my words, but let me set out what I think we can do with free speech. I think it's a good example of a human right we should strengthen amidst all of the other critique and concerns. It's a quintessentially British freedom. It is the liberty that guards all of the others. And we have seen it eroded in recent years by a combination. I think under EU law, you had the right to be forgotten. We've seen incrementally principles of continental-style privacy approaches to legal protections introduced, which is not really the tradition in this country. We're more pro-transparency and accountability. And I think there is also a sense that there are some issues and debates that have been rendered off limits, which is wrong. I mean, I believe in respectful but robust debate, and I think we need to very carefully protect the parameters for rambunctious, vigorous debate, and I think a Bill of Rights can do that.
You mentioned going in a sort of continental fashion. Can you give me some examples of your fear there, Mr. Raab?
Well, I remember back, the one I always think of, and there's been other more recent ones, but the Max Molesey case and in relation to reports around him. But fundamentally, those kinds of cases, I think in the UK, we don't have continental-style privacy laws that protect people in positions of influence. Whether we like it or not as politicians or indeed as celebrities and others in this country, I think we do have a stronger emphasis on transparency and free speech. I think that's very much part of our history, but I think it's part of our DNA as a country. And therefore, I don't think we should be abashed. I think we should be proud to say, do you know what? We can strengthen the protection that we give to freedom of speech. There are other things we want to do, of course, as well. Cut out some of the abuses to the system, particularly around foreign national offenders, trumping deportation orders on, I think, ever-elastic grounds. And there's a general sense in which the goalposts on human rights shift incrementally through legal argument in courts. That has been the result of the Human Rights Act. I'm not criticising the judges, but I do think we should restore some democratic accountability over the expansion of rights. And I think that would reintroduce a bit more common sense to the system.
I guess one of the most prominent recent examples my listeners can relate to, Mr. Raab, would be that of the columnist Rod Liddle, who was invited to speak at Durham University, and a number of students protested and actually walked out. Should they have done that? Is it right for Mr. Liddle to be able to address the students in Durham?
I think the practice of no platforming and trying to introduce a type of censorship by the back door is something we should guard against, particularly in universities, which ought to be a fulcrum, a hotbed of vigorous but wide-ranging, diverse debate. And I think if freedom of speech means anything, it means that we do have to listen to views that we don't always agree with. I mean, you as a presenter, me as a politician, right? That this is our bread and butter. And I sometimes feel, and having been Foreign Secretary and been around the world and looked at the human rights records in other countries, sometimes think we don't, we might take for granted that. I think it's precious, and I think we need to preserve it.
So, should Mr. Liddle have been able to speak at Durham?
I think if he's been invited, I don't think it's right for him somehow to be barred.
I'm sitting in the dining hall or the lecture hall, and I'm a trans student, and I feel desperately uncomfortable, but that is his right to make me feel uncomfortable?
Well, look, the debate around trans rights is something which is very important. It's very sensitive. There are different views. We've heard some of the debates between the champions of trans rights and other champions of female rights and feminist rights. And all I would say about this, without getting sucked into the substantive debate, is we need to learn to listen to each other a bit more. I think that can be done respectfully, but we do need to preserve the parameters of free speech and vigorous debate and not become so sensitive that we reduce our resilience to listen to other people's views. I think that's a cornerstone of democracy. I think that is something we can strengthen with a Bill of Rights.
To those who suggest this idea of this new Human Rights Act or this work is the dead cat to distract us all from potential Christmas parties or the Afghan evacuation, how would you respond?
Well, look, feel free to criticise the proposals
But
on the
is it the
substance.
dead
I'll come
cat?
back. It's ridiculous. I've been working on this. I wrote a book about human rights reform in 2009, The Assault on Liberty, What Went Wrong with Rights. I worked on this as Human Rights Minister under David Cameron. It's in our manifesto. And the reason we're putting this consultation forward, and I've been champing at the bit to do so, is precisely so we can have a proper debate about it, and then we can introduce the Bill of Rights before the next election so it's in force, and we restore a bit of common sense to our system.
Of course, it was British lawyers who drafted the European Convention on Human Rights, wasn't it? We will stay in that convention.
We'll stay in the convention. I think if you look at the list of rights protected in the ECHR, it's pretty common sense. The problem has been with the elastic interpretation and application and the exponential expansion of rights over time. That's where you need some common sense. That's where we need Parliament, elected lawmakers like me, like members across the House of Commons, to hold to account and to decide who writes the laws of the land in this country.
Couldn't that result in more people having to go to the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg then?
Look, I don't think that that's a big risk. Of course, everyone
Why
can already
wouldn't they
go.
seek to go there?
Well, they can do, and that's their
But
right.
they will,
as it is.
if this is reworked, what other recourse might they have?
No, they'll still have recourse to human rights remedies under UK law, but with more restraint. We'll have a permission stage to cut out the frivolous claims. We'll allow judges, courts to take into account the conduct of claimants. So if they've behaved badly, let alone unlawfully, that can be taken into account. If people want to take their case to Strasbourg, so be it. But at the end of the day, Strasbourg has undergone a period of reform. Since the Brighton Declaration in 2012, they've talked about an age of subsidiarity, which means more respect for the fact that it's for the UK courts and UK Parliament to decide what the parameters are in this country, particularly on very sensitive, finely balanced issues. So, look, I think we can assert that margin of appreciation. We should have a dialogue with Strasbourg. I remember on prisoner voting, Nick, everyone said we had to cave in, we had to give prisoners the vote. I went and talked to the Committee of Ministers in Strasbourg. We had that sensible dialogue. We didn't give prisoners the vote. I think a Bill of Rights can codify that kind of approach.
Lastly, last couple of questions. You referenced your time as Foreign Secretary. You'll recall it was on your watch that Anne Secoulis, you urged her to do the right thing and cooperate with the British criminal justice system. Of course, we now know that that will move forward. A word on that, if you would, Mr. Raab.
Yes, I want to protect the integrity of those proceedings, but of course we wanted to clear the way for justice to be done and a trial to be had, and I'm very pleased for the family of Harry Dunn that that's possible now.
Just coming back lastly to the drive for boosters, the Prime Minister talking about 1 million a day. Obviously it was day one yesterday, but there were understandable problems. Are you still holding to that number? You still think you can deliver 1 million a day?
The aim is to get everyone over 18 offered the booster by the end of the year. We got 500,000 people jabbed on Saturday. We're ramping up the capacity. And the reason we want to do that, along with the other measures that we're introducing, is because we know, and it's still quite sketchy on Omicron, but if we get people that booster, they're over 70% protected from Omicron, which is spreading fast and therefore creates a risk that we have to address now.
And lastly, are you nervous there could be resignations over this Plan B vote later today? There are suggestions that there could be some junior ministers who might say, up with this we will not put.
Look, there's always this kind of reporting in the lead up to a big vote. What I would do is respectfully say to all of my colleagues, and indeed to MPs across the House of Commons, that the combination of the booster campaign with these very targeted, balanced interventions and measures we're taking is the right one. I think it's what the public will want to see, and I hope people will vote for it.
Grateful for your time as ever, Dominic Raab. Thank you. 3 minutes after 8, appearing here on LBC when news is next.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the Prime Minister could face a major Commons rebellion later over his Plan B COVID measures.